Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to part 3 of my training course to learn how to create, how to develop iOS apps using Swift, SwiftUI and Xcode when you're a complete beginner. So this is part 3. This means that before there have been two previous parts where we've already covered quite a lot of ground. So if you're joining for this part 3, a quick reminder that as a support for this course, I'm using a tutorial released by Apple a few weeks ago as of when I'm recording the course. So right now we are at the beginning of May 2024. So you have the link to the course in the description. And let me show you what we have covered in the past weeks. So in the first video, we covered how to explore Xcode and build a super basic a super basic screen of an app in SwiftUI, a basic screen of an iOS app, of course. And in this first part, we also covered the second chapter, which was how to create views, structure, and properties, and how to start to create components that could be reused in several places of an app. Then in the second part, we covered chapter 3, which was quite long, longer than I expected, if you remember. And it was about how to lay out and style your view. So we had learned how to position text and images, but in this chapter, we learn how to position them more precisely to fit the constraint of an actual layout where you will want to maybe center things, put an amount of space before and after, all of this stuff, and also style. So by styling, we mean things like setting a given font, a given color, everything that is about how the information is presented. And today, we're going to cover chapter 4, which is about buttons and state. There is still one more chapter after, so this one about lists and text fields, but I think it will be for next time because as you will see, chapter 4 is also quite long. So I think I've said more than enough for the introduction. Just as always, this is being recorded live, so if you're watching live first, thank you so much for being here this evening. And as always, if you have any question, any remark, please make it in the chat. I do my best to answer it. And you're probably asking a question that people watching the replay already have. So you're giving them a voice, which is super cool. And I'm sure that they will thank you for it. So let's get started. Buttons and state. Before we get started, as always, I will make myself a bit smaller because I don't want to hide the code. The code is the interesting content in this series of videos. So, what are we going to learn in this section? We learn how to update the UI with state. So this word state here, which is introduced maybe for the first time, you will see is quite an important word, in this tutorial, but also in app development as a whole. You will often see the word state come up, and there is a good reason for it. We'll explore this today. So we'll explore how add state properties and buttons work to update the UI of your app by creating an app to roll a virtual dice. So by buttons, we mean something that you can tap on, and more generally, the kind of components that the user can interact with. So it's about how to handle events that are triggered by the user when they interact with the UI. So we'll add the functionality to increase or decrease the number of dice on the screen to play different kinds of games. So we'll be able to roll 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even more dices. And for that, I guess we'll need to have two buttons, one to increase the quantity of dice and of dices, and one to reduce it, to decrease it, and one button to actually roll the dice. Or roll the dices. I'm not sure, yes, no, singular is dice, so it would be dices. Let me know if I'm wrong. So section 1 will be about creating a custom view, something that we've already done before. So actually, they refer to a previous chapter, so customize views with properties that we covered in the first video. We learned to factor out repeated elements of our interface into a custom view to make an app with multiple dice. So maybe dice is actually plural, and dice is like, we don't take an S, Okay, so 1 dice, 2 die. Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. I didn't know that one. Or maybe I knew about it and I had forgotten about it. Okay, so that's good to know about this one. So create a custom view to represent a single dice, then use it to make more dice in your app. Okay, at least now I will not be making that mistake for the rest of the live stream. Perfect. So step 1 is creating a new iOS app project in Xcode. So as always, I've already taken care of it and I'm on this screen inside Xcode. So the project, how do we call it? We call it Dice Roller. All right. Oh, 1 die, 2 dice. So what's interesting is that here, they said dice in singular. So maybe it's a thing about, I don't know, like maybe like British English versus American English, or maybe it's like the rules have changed recently. I know that in France there are a lot of words that had like weird spellings, and they updated it in the 90s. So maybe that's also the same thing but in English. So I'm creating the app called Dice Roller. So product name, and they let me know that I have Shift pressed. Okay. Then, all right, everything else is good. Swift UI, Swift, perfect. I'm gonna put it just on my desktop. All right. What's next? Next, we create a SwiftUI view file named Dice View. So we've done it quite a few times in the past. So Command N to create a new file. We create a SwiftUI view and we call it Dice View. It's been created right here. Let me make it full screen so that you can see and you have a lot of room to see it. Then we replace the body, the code inside the body with an image of a dice. And we are lucky because we have these images available in SF symbols. That once again shows just how useful SF symbol can be. So let me make it so that you can see the preview, so like that. So it's quite small, but it should still see. It should still be readable. Hopefully, we will make it a little bit bigger by adding some style to the image. And so they say exactly what I said. So SF symbols has images for all 6 sides of a dice. Change the number at the end of the image name to see each one. So we can try it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you try 7, of course, it doesn't exist. So they only have a 6-faced die. And you can see here it's spelled correctly. So I guess they got it wrong in the tutorial. I'm going to hide the preview because I already show it in Xcode, and I mean, often I cover it and it's not that great. Okay. I see a question about which framework I would recommend to get a job. It's a bit, maybe I will come back to it later, but it's quite a difficult question to answer in a short way. But you can check out my website, swiftwithvincent.com, and I have an article on this topic. So actually, I think I would recommend that you check it out. I guess it's the easiest because otherwise it's going to take a bit too much time out of the main content. And yeah, you only have 6 face dice, so you cannot do Dungeons and Dragons and the other war games. Indeed, I wonder maybe there are like other dice in SF symbol, but under a different name. You can actually check it if you're curious to see whether or not it's available. Okay. Next step is to add a property to the view to represent the number of pips on the dice. So the number of pips, I guess, is the number of dots. I guess is the scientific number for the black dots. So I'm adding it. Let me add it so outside of the body, but it's still inside the struct dice view. Okay. Let me go back to Safari. And so they say that we use the assignment operator to give the property a default value of 1. We might have done it before in the previous chapter, but they didn't call it out. But here, this allows us to give a default value. But we can still provide another value through the initializer if we want, and it will override this default value right here. So here they go into a bit more details about this syntax we've just written. So they say that this property is marked with the keyword var. I explained this, the difference between var and let a little bit before. So, I mean, before in the previous video. So the keyword var means that you can assign new values to it. The word that you will often find is that the property is mutable. It can be changed. It can be updated. The opposite of it is let. So the opposite of var is let. And when a property is let or a let constant, then it means that it is constant. You can also read that it's immutable. And so it means that the value can never be changed. It will contain the value that was set when created, and it will never be allowed to change. And so this view is dynamic. You'll change the value of the property when people roll the dice. So that's why it's a var. When you assign a default value to a structure's property, it's not required in initializer. That's why you didn't have to change the dice view instance in the preview to include number of pips. It's true that before, when we only declare properties like that, we would have this error that says, okay, you're missing the value when you initialize and you need to provide it. But since we're already providing a default value, we don't need to provide one here. However, if you want, you can still override with another value. All right. Step 6, we are going to use string interpolation. So what allows us to inject more complex data types inside a string to display the dice image using the value of your new property. And they say experiment, change the default value of number of pips to see the corresponding dice images. So once again, I'm copy pasting, but if you're learning Swift, I would really recommend that you try to write it yourself. I'm copy pasting because it's easier and there is less room of making a mistake. But if you're learning, writing it helps a lot, memorizing things efficiently. So here we have 1, so we show the dice of 1. But if I put 4, you can see that now we should show, yes, we show the dice of 4. And I can put 1 here, but I can override the value here and say 4 or 5. So you can see how it works. So basically, from this value here, we derive the name of the SF symbol that we want to display. That's how it works. And this approach, while simple, is actually used quite a lot in production. I've used variation of this trick to generate a key for a resource, whether it's an image, a localized string, or any kind of file in a way, by having like a constant part and the part that changes depending on some value. It's actually quite a common pattern. So it's good that they show it in the tutorial because you will probably need to use it, reuse it at some point. So it's good to know that like the more tools you have, the more effective you can be. So this is definitely a tool that you want to add to your tool belt if you're a beginner. So step 7, now we're going to use some modifiers to increase the size of the image. The resizable modifier tells the image it can stretch to fill any available space. So remember in the last video, we covered the concept of intrinsic size. So right now the image has an intrinsic size, meaning that it knows which size it needs to display its content fully. But when we make it resizable, instead, it will become the kind of view that try to occupy as much space as available. So it's interesting to do it in 2 times. First, we apply the modifier resizable, and now it takes as much space as possible. So really trying to fill in all of the space available. You can see it like that. You can see that it doesn't respect the aspect ratio of the image because the image is stretched vertically. And then we're going to add the frame modifier to say, okay, we want to constrain it to an available space of 100. So this view here is still trying to take as much space as it can, but now it's only offered this space of 100 by 100. That's why it no longer takes the full screen. But it's important to understand that the logic is still the same. It still tries to take as much space as possible. We've just constrained it into a smaller space. And you can see that if I do 200 now, it's stretched vertically again. So there is no magic here. It's just these 2 mechanisms of let's take as much space as possible and then let's take as much space as available and then let's constrain the amount of available space that allows us to give a given size to the image. That's why I wanted to highlight it because it's quite important to understand that this mechanism is twofold. And so, yeah, the resizable modifier tells the image it can stretch to fill any available space. You don't want the dice to fill all the available space, so you limit the image by setting its frame size. So actually, they did a great job of explaining it. So once again, congrats to whoever wrote this tutorial because they really did a great job at explaining things step by step. And so they say you typically match the size of SF symbols to their surroundings content using the font modifier, but in this case, you're using the image as purely graphical content, so it's okay to use resizable and frame. They say that because very often when you use an icon, it doesn't go alone. Very often an icon, it accompanies a piece of text. Typically, you will have the save icon next to the text that says save. And so you want to have the same size for both the text and the icon. And so it's very convenient to use the font modifier for both. But here we are in this rarer, more rare. I'm not sure if you say more rare or rarer. Like rarer feels weird to say, so I will say more rare or less current situation where you actually want to display the image by itself, and so it makes sense to give it a size just like you would for any kind of image. So we finished section 1. Now we're going to add a button to roll the dice. So we are introducing this button concept, which is supposed to be the center of this chapter. So add a button to roll the dice. We're going to use a button to change the image of the dice. A button uses a closure to run code when a person taps it. Rather, I would say when the user taps it, because you could automate tapping the button in some way. So it might be more general than a person. So step 1, we're going to embed the image in a VStack so that we can add the button below it. So remember, you can do it by writing code, but you can also do it in Xcode. Right-click on the image, embed in VStack, it's done. So step 2, inside the VStack, below the image and its modifiers, start typing button. Code Completion will offer you several suggestions. Choose the one with a title key and an action. If you see title instead of title key, choose that initializer. I guess there might have been different names depending on versions of Xcode, for instance. I think I'm just going to do Control and I in order to reindent the code. And so here, so button, and we want this one. So let's use it. 2 arguments, a localized string key, and an action closure. If they don't explain what closure is, I will do it just after. So don't be scared if you've never seen the word closure. I will explain it regardless. So we replace the first placeholder with the string roll. So what's a localized string key? It's basically a string, except that when our app will be executed, SwiftUI will try to see if inside our app we have a localization for this key. So if we have a translation, basically, in order to match the language of the user. That's the difference. I won't go into much more details about this because I could spend much more time. If you want to learn more about localizing an app and localized string keys, it's not hard to find resources. That's why I'm going to stop here. I just want to give you the pointer on what this means. And now the second parameter. So action, parentheses, arrow, void. It's a closure that executes code when people tap the button. So a closure, it's really a piece of code that can be executed at a later time. It's the most simple way to define it. You could say it's a piece of code that you can assign to a variable and then call later. That's the easiest way to define it. And of course, when I say assign to a variable, it includes that you can also pass it as an argument. A more correct way to say it, a more generic way, would be to say that it's an expression. It's the ability to write a piece of code that you can use as an expression, and expressions, they can be assigned to variables, they can be passed as arguments, they can be used in many kinds of contexts. So they say press tab to select the placeholder and then press return. I did it before, so that's why I went from this syntax here to this one right here. I selected the placeholder by doing tab and then I pressed enter so that I had this shorter syntax. Why has the name of the argument action disappeared? It's something that's called in Swift the trailing closure syntax, and the rule is that if the last argument of a function, here the initializer of a button, is a closure, then you can pass the closure after the call of the initializer. It's because it makes the code a little bit nicer to read. And actually, it's the same for VStack. VStack, if you look, we saw it last time, the initializer takes some arguments with default values and then at the end a closure. And we don't need to pass to write the name of the closure, which is content, because it's the last argument of the argument list. So we do the same here for the button. And so they explain it actually here. Xcode removes the action parameter completely and replaces it with a closure contained in a pair of braces. There's a code placeholder inside the braces where you write your code for the button. Okay, so they don't explain it that well, so I'm glad I gave this extra information. So now we're going to replace the last placeholder, so the one inside the closure, with the code to choose a random number for the pips of the dice, and so it's the code that will be run every time we click on the button to roll the dice. And so we set the property number of pips with a random integer between the interval of 1 and 6, 6 being included. So how do you say roll in French? So in French, roll the dice would be said jeter the dé, and it's more throwing the dice rather than rolling the dice, actually. And the expression would be, there is the saying les dés sont jetés, and it's kind of saying like it's kind of like all bets are off, like the dice has been cast. Cast would be the more correct. Yeah, we say casting a dice more than throwing. Casting is more correct. And so yeah, we say the dice have been cast, but rolling, I don't think there is an equivalent, or maybe I don't know it, or it's less familiar, but it's more like a casting. Yeah, we say casting the dice like we would say like a casting a vote, actually. So yeah, that would be the French translation. And you're right, like maybe I should do a video on localization one day. You know what? I'm making a note to cover maybe this topic one day, because I think I've never covered it. And there are things to say now. There are several APIs that you can use, so that might make for a nice video. Oh, we have an interesting error here. Cannot assign to property. Self is immutable. So I'm sure they will explain how to solve it, because otherwise it will be the end of the tutorial. So let's see how they explain it before I start explaining it myself. But first, they say a few things about the code we wrote inside the closure. So they say that int.random selects a random integer from the range inside its parentheses. So now we know that it's the range that we passed as an argument. The code 1.6 creates a range of integers from 1 to 6, 6 being included. Note, this is another example of using an assignment operator. This time you're updating the value of number of pips every time the code runs. Okay, and now there is an error in your code that you'll fix in the next section by changing number of pips into an addState property. So section 3, use state to update a view. So the word state is starting to make its appearance. So all apps have data or state that changes over time. When an app changes state, it may need to update its interface. However, SwiftUI doesn't monitor every property in an app by default. In this app, you'll need to update the image when a person taps the roll button. To tell SwiftUI to monitor number of pips and update the UI when it changes, mark the property with the keyword addState. So this idea that state is all of the data that changes over the time that your app is open is very central to app development. And one of the big challenge of app development, and conversely, one of the big source of bugs in apps, is whenever there is a lack of synchronization between the data, the state of the data, and what's reflected by the UI. Typical example is the UI is showing a value that is outdated, for instance. So there is a more recent value in the data model, but it's not reflected on the screen and the user can't see it. Typical example of a bug. And one of the core principles of SwiftUI is to try and make the UI depend as much as possible on the data. It's what's called having a reactive UI. And the idea is that as soon as the data changes, the UI is automatically updated without the need to trigger anything in the code manually. And if there is nothing to trigger manually, it means that you can't forget to trigger it. And so it's a whole category of bug that theoretically becomes impossible to happen. So SwiftUI did better than UIKit on this respect, because in UIKit you had to manually update the value of your UI components whenever your UI would change. And that's why Apple introduced the framework Combine a few years ago to try and have a way to make the UI depend on changes of data. In the iOS community, you had a very popular framework called Eric Swift that also tried to do the same thing. And they were all trying to solve this issue of how do you manage state at scale in a large app, which is arguably one of the biggest challenge that you have to face when you're doing iOS app development on an app that is large enough. But spoiler alert, you reach large enough quite easily. Actually, we all imagine like it's the very big apps, but no, even a single project that you work on for a month is large enough that you can get into some pretty tricky situations. So step 1, make number of pips a addState property. Then tap the roll button a few times to check that the image changes. View state is owned by the view. You always mark addState properties private, so other views can't interfere with their value. All right. So we mark it at state and we make it private. They put the private after the at state. I will do the same. So okay, so yeah, I remember that the rule, so whether you say like closer instead of more close, it's when there is a single syllable, yeah. So rare, I guess it's two syllables, yeah, because there is re, okay. Yeah, it's always hard for French speakers because, for instance, close, yeah, you say close and closer. So close counts as a single syllable according to this rule. And rare, I guess it's rarer. Maybe it's rarer actually. It's just that it feels weird saying it from a French speaking, but like it's the kind of stuff that you learn in school and then you kind of do it intuitively. But there is always a moment where like you have a doubt and you don't have Grammarly when you're speaking. That's the difference between when I'm writing an email or written content. And yeah, okay, so that makes sense in a way. Just that it feels so weird to say it, but yeah, exactly. Exactly, like syllables, counting syllables when you're not a native speaker, it's always a bit of like you're making guesses, educated guesses, but it's very hard to get it right. Okay, so now the app should work. So if I click on roll, indeed, you can see that it works. We are rolling the dice. The UI isn't pretty, but we are rolling the dice. Let me make it a little bit bigger so that you can see it even more. But the app is working. We have a working rolling dice, which should be random because we can assume that this function is random. I mean that it's like correct in the sense that it's not it's a fair dice. I remember that word. It's a fair dice. So I won't go into too much of the details of why adding at state solved the error message that we saw. I cover it a bit more in my other series about SwiftUI, which is called Learning SwiftUI when you already know UIKit. Actually, it's Learning SwiftUI when you already have some experience with iOS. So if you want to learn more about this error, I would recommend you check out this series of videos because I can't cover it right now because you need to know a lot of concepts about Swift that are not covered in this tutorial, so I won't go into the details. But if you want to learn more about why adding at state solved the issue of saying self is immutable inside the body, it's very interesting to understand why, so I can only encourage you to try and do so. But if it feels complex, don't worry, it's normal because it puts concepts in practice that we haven't covered in this tutorial, typically reference types versus value types. So step 2, you add a border to the button to set it apart from the image. So what we've done in the previous video, so adding style to our view. And what's interesting is that you can see that we use a button style this time. So we use a predefined style for the button. By the way, you can still you can create your own button style, actually. I will cover it in a future video that I don't know when I will release, but it's ready to be released. So I will cover this in a future video. But you can put, when you have several buttons with the same style, you can factor this code out into a button style. And here we're using one of the built-in button styles, which is to have this bordered button. So to have this border with rounded rectangles, that is characteristic of what you can see inside iOS apps. I see a few messages, so let me go over them. So passing at state based on string interpretation is a technique I've been looking for. Thank you so much for that clear explanation with the example. Okay, so I'm glad that I've been able to unlock you, because yes, I remember someone saying last time that they were stuck on this chapter, so maybe it was actually you. So I'm glad if you've been able to be unstuck. And indeed, this part can be, that's the part where like you need to understand what's happening in order to be able to keep making some progress. So like the key idea here is that the at state property is owned by the view, and so it's the data model, and from it we derive the identifier of the image that we pass to the image, which actually displays the image. You say I can assume it can be even more powerful with key paths. Yeah, and actually SwiftUI makes quite a lot of use of key paths when you want to refer to a property. Can I do a learn Objective-C video when you already know Swift? I thought about it before, but people who want to learn Objective-C, I feel like it's basically only people working at that plan to work at Meta on Instagram or on WhatsApp. And the problem is that they are already super capable, and they will learn it by just reading the documentation. So I feel like I like the idea, but I'm afraid it's maybe a bit too much niche at this point. But I did do a video where I was going over the code of my old personal projects from like 10 years ago, and some of them, 2 out of 3, were in Objective-C. So I kind of have this video where I talk a bit about Objective-C, but it's not a comprehensive course by any means. Okay. So next step, now we're going to make a transition fade from the old dice image to the new one. So we're going to animate stuff. So for this, we put our code inside the view, inside the closures we pass to the function with animation. And so they actually say it here, adding with animation instructs SwiftUI to animate any state changes that occur within its code, or rather within the closure that we pass to the function. It uses a trailing closure similar to the way that button works. So I change the code like this. So once again, there is nothing magic here. This is just a function that takes a closure as an argument. There is nothing magic, there is nothing hard-coded into the compiler. We are just calling a function and passing it a closure. And as a consequence, you can see that now there is an animation. We have a fade in out, and so the old die is fading out while the new die is fading in. And arguably, this is more agreeable to the eye. I'm not sure how much into details of how animations work in SwiftUI this tutorial will go, but if you want to learn more about this, once again, this is a topic that I cover in my other series of videos. So learning SwiftUI when you already know UIKit, there is a video dedicated to it. It's called, I think, Animations and Transitions. So if you want to check out more info about how animations work in SwiftUI, I can really recommend that you check this video out. And now we are into section 4. And section 4 is all about creating a dynamic display of dice. So we're going to add functionality to choose the number of dice by creating another property. So marking the property with addState ensures that the interface updates when the number of dice changes. So addState is really this way to say my UI depends on this piece of state. So when this piece of state changes, please update the UI automatically for me. And when you have this mechanism, it becomes impossible to forget to update the UI when what's inside the asset property changes. And that solves, as I was saying, a ton of bugs. So in the content view of the project, so let me go in the content view, so the basic content view that you get when you create a SwiftUI app, we're going to replace the content of the VStack with a title. So we replace the content with this text, which has the font large title and also lowercase small caps. Interesting, I didn't know this modifier. What does it do? It adjusts the font to enable lowercase small capitals. So this function turns lowercase characters into small capitals for the font. It is generally used for display lines set in large and small caps, such as titles. It may include forms related to small capitals, such as old-style figures. So interesting, I didn't know this, that you could do this. So this shows just how powerful SwiftUI actually is. And so they say you can use modifiers on the font type the same way that you use them with views. So you can chain other font modifiers on large title to see the effects. If you want, you can put the modifiers on separate lines, so large title, lowercase small caps, and then bold. So it's interesting because in the past, we've done something like calling the modifier font weight and then saying a font weight of bold, but as they are suggesting, instead, what you can do is that you can call the modifier bold on the font itself, and it does the same thing. The two are actually equivalent. So it's good to know. I didn't know, or maybe I knew it, but I forgot. But you can have also this other syntax. So both are valid. I would say in a project, just be consistent. Don't use one in half the file and the other in the other half of your views. Try to be consistent, but I would say that both syntaxes seem to be quite equivalent. Actually, no, there is one difference, is that here it's always going to be bold, so bold is kind of like hard-coded, whereas when you pass in a font weight, so like that, you could imagine passing a different value as an argument depending on some value. So actually, this gives a bit more flexibility than the other syntax. So they are not, I mean, they're equivalent in the sense that when you call bold using both syntaxes, it does the same thing, but this syntax offers more possibilities than the other one. What's the next step? Then we add an H-stack with 3 dice views instances. And they say try rolling each dice. So we'll do that. So let me add the H-stack inside the VStack. So at this level right here. So indeed, we have our 3 dice. And I see Evolving SwiftUI is saying lowercase small caps looks pretty cool. I had no idea it was present in Swift. We'll be using it in my apps for sure. Yeah, it looks pretty nice. And if you have an app where this kind of aesthetic makes sense, definitely, like if you're a beginner, don't use it everywhere. Like don't use it for a long copy of text typically, but for a title that is a little bit stylized, and in this case, it gives a little bit of like, I don't know, it gives a bit of a retro feeling, you know. So I think it plays really nice. So yeah, really cool of Apple to calling this feature out, because I had no idea that you could do it. Okay, so then to be able to display any number of dice, we're going to use a for each view. Repeat dice view 3 times using a range from 1 to 3. Type the code manually. For each has code completion options for many different uses. So right now we do a for each, but we do a for each with a static number of elements that we iterate upon. So inside the H-stack, we put the for each. And so you can see that the content hasn't changed, because we say for each element, for each integer in the interval from 1 to 3 included, so there are only 3 elements, 1, 2, and 3, we show a dice view. And you can see here we say that for the ID, we use the description. So for each needs to have an ID, meaning that it needs to have something to identify each value. And the reason is that SwiftUI will automatically animate changes, but if it animates changes, it needs to be able to say, okay, this item has moved to another position. And so it needs to be able to say, okay, these two items are the same. And this is done through a protocol called Identifiable, which lets you declare an ID. Or when you don't want to do that, you can just pass a key path, which refers to a property that will be used as the ID. And so here we're using the description, which is the textual representation of the value. This might not be a best practice in production, to be honest, because description, they often say only use this for debug purposes. There have been situations where basically what can happen is that Apple can change what the description returns at any point. So this is not the best. But it's okay for this example. I see a great question. Does for each also requires hashable conformance or just identifiable? So what I would say is that for each requires, let's see, it depends on the ini that you pass. But if you pass, actually, you know what? Yeah, ID self also works, but I guess this, since it's a bit more complex to explain how it works, I guess they didn't want it to put it in the tutorial for this reason, and rightfully so. But this is indeed much more correct. I won't go into what this means, but if you want to know more about it, I have a video on my channel that is about key paths. I think it's called Why You Should Use Key Paths. Fair warning, it's quite an old video. It's like in my first 3 months of putting out videos, so it's quite old and dated, but the content is still valid, so you can check it out to understand what this syntax means. And so for each, I wanted to check the init that it has, and what I think is gonna happen is that if I try to do the for each that only takes, so it needs to be a random access collection here, but actually, you know, the best way is to just remove this argument and see what happens. So we have an error that says cannot convert value close range int to explicit argument of type ranged int. Oh yes, I'm going to make it like that. So actually this works. So actually for each, it seems that you don't need to be identifiable. Actually, you just need to be hashable, and integers are hashable by default. So actually, I think the reason why they have to do this is because they want to use the closed range interval. So by the way, what is the difference between this and this is that this says from 1 to 3, but 3 not included. So this contains 1 and 2, whereas this contains 1, 2, and 3. And for some reason, this, you can use it alone, but you can't use this one, the closed version of it. And the equivalent would be doing this, but this is more complex. So I understand that for tutorial, they took a shortcut and they said, okay, let's use this, this syntax, even though it might not be the most correct, correct one, or rather the one with the, that's the more faithful to the best practices you would want to apply in a real app. And so the conclusion to this debate is that for each actually only needs conformance to hashable and not identifiable. It's list that needs conformance to identifiable. And you're saying, I think regardless of that, I feel like out of muscle memory, we would just use, yeah, when you already know SwiftUI and you're used to it, you would do \self, but I understand that for a total beginner, like this thing, like self has a whole new meaning here, and it feels weird. It feels so weird, the syntax, that when they released key paths, initially they didn't include this because they hadn't like considered that you would need this at some point. So yeah, it would feel weird for a beginner. Interesting. If you do for each where data contains objects that have a large memory footprint, will using \self be slower than conforming to identifiable and using ID? I would say, and I haven't tested it, so it's only like an educated guess, but I would say that using ID \self is probably the same thing than using the protocol identifiable, because under the hood, what it does is that the algorithm that SwiftUI runs under the hood needs an ID, and so it's going to access this ID either by invoking a key path on an object or by calling the property ID on the object. So honestly, I would tend to say it's probably the same thing, but I haven't measured it. So, and you should never make assumptions on performances without measuring. So I would say that conceptually, it should be the same to pass an ID or to convert to identifiable. Now, there might be small and subtle differences in performances, maybe, but if there are, I'm not aware of them. But that's a good point. Thank you for raising it. Okay. Here they say, so the for each view is dynamic. It computes its subviews based on its input, which may change with the state of the app. You create a range using 1 all the way through to 3, just as you did it in int.random 1 all the way to 6. The for each view creates one dice view for each value in the range. So now this range, so 1 to 3, is static. To make it adapt to any number of dice, you'll again use view state. This time with state that will be owned by the content view. So we have state owned across 2 different views. So to make it adapt to a number of dice, you'll once again use view state. I've read this before. Add a new state property for the number of dice. So we add this as an add state property of here the content view. All right. Let's see. So now we use the new property to make the range dynamic. And they say, try changing the default value of number of dice to see how the interface changes. So instead of 3, we say number of dice. Okay. Let me resume the preview. And so let's see by changing the value here. So 1, 2, 3. And now I'm going to 23. Ooh, so many dice that they actually render outside of the screen. What's the reason? I think it's because we've given them a frame that's static of 100 and it cannot go like smaller, I guess. And so that's why it goes completely crazy. So it's not perfect code. Maybe we will add some bounding in the number of dice that you can add, but at least it works in the sense that we've made the number of dice dynamic now. So next step. Below the for each view and the H stack, add 2 buttons to increase and decrease the number of dice. So we add an H stack after the other H stack. So here, we're still inside the V stack, however. So remove dice, add dice. Look at the code inside each button's closure. In Swift, you can use plus equal and minus equal to add or subtract from a property's current value. In this case, you're adding or subtracting 1. So number of dice plus equal 1 is the same than number of dice equal number of dice plus 1. And this syntax is so common in computer science that you have this shorthand operator that avoids having to use to repeat the name of the variable twice. And same thing here, this is the same than number of dice equal number of dice minus 1. Same logic right here. Okay, try out the button to make sure that they work. So remove a dice, add a dice, and we can see that from 4 dice, it's when there are issues. And you can see that it starts like getting up like that because there is not enough space to display like the text. And so it's like, it feels like a weird like insect, you know, it feels super weird. But it's kind of funny. And you can go all the way. Oh, if you go to 0, then you have a crash. You crash the preview because the interval from 1 to 0 is invalid, because an interval, the left value must always be less than or equal to the one on the right. And so this is just like dividing by 0 or force unwrapping a nil value. This crashes your app and your preview. So I'm just going to restart the preview. Okay. Step 7, reduce the number of dice to 1. Actually, it's what I did. So they show the preview crashes because the range 1.0 isn't valid. So step 8, to prevent people from tapping the remove dice button when there's only one dice view, you can disable the button to prevent the crash and give people a visual cue that the button is unresponsive. Use the disabled modifier to disable the remove dice button when number of dice has a value of 1. So, like that. And what we've implemented here is what's called actually business logic in an app. If you ever see this word of like business logic, it's about the logic of what the app does. And so here is the UI business logic is the rules of how the UI operate. And so you can see that now we cannot go lower than 1 dice. They give an explanation of what we've written here, so this expression right here. So you use the equal operator to check whether two numbers are equal. Notice that equal is very different than just one equal. That's one of the big difference between math and computer science, is that in math, equal means equality, whereas in computer science, in most languages, at least all of the languages from the C family, so from languages that got their syntax derived from the C language, equal means assigning and equal means equality. So very important to understand this, because otherwise it can be very confusing. So the result of this comparison is a bool, so a value, a type which has one of two possible values, true or false. When number of dice equal 1 is true, the modifier disables the button. And you're saying it's not called housekeeping. Yeah, that might also be like one of the nicknames for this kind of rules. Honestly, I think every person has their own name for it. Every company, every methodology has their own name, but the bottom idea is always the same. It's the rules of how the UI should behave. Like when should buttons be enabled, disabled, when should errors be presented to the user, all of these things, which might seem easy, but they are often quite a challenging part, because in many iOS apps, you will have many apps that what they do actually is that they get data and they send data to a backend, and the only thing that the app does, the only logic of the app is to actually manage the UI in a correct state. So that's why there are people that says there was a debate. Yeah, exactly. So there was a debate about last year about what's the business logic. There were people saying an app should have no business logic. It should all be on the server. Yes, that's true, but it's like there is always something that is a logic and that serves something related to what the app does. So there is always an amount of business logic, and you can call it UI business logic if you want, instead of data business logic. It makes total sense. But what I want to highlight with this is that these words, very often they can feel very complex. It can feel that there are subtle nuances behind them, but to be honest, I feel most of the time every person has their own word to refer to it and its own meaning. And very often people talk about the same thing, but with different words. One thing I've learned is that when working with customers, it's better to just say the logic of the app and not try to go into any nuance, because everyone has their own version of it, and people tend to feel annoyed when you don't have the same version of the vocabulary than what they do. So to prevent conflict, I just use the word logic, and it has always served me well. So that's what I would recommend also doing. And yeah, exactly. You have people telling that all of the logic should be on the server, and it can make sense. For years, I worked on banking apps, and it's the kind of apps where all of the logic is on the server, almost all of the logic, because you cannot trust the app to make a transfer. It's the backend of the bank that should be trusted for this, for very good and obvious reasons. And these days I've worked on the photo room app, and it's the opposite. There is some business logic to store the data, for instance, but all of the image editing happens mostly on the app itself. A few things happen on the backend because machine learning and generative AI is costly to run on the device, but there is much more business logic on the app. All of that to say that the amount of business logic that you have in an app always varies, but there will still be an amount of logic left, because ultimately the app has to do something. Otherwise, it's just an empty app that displays nothing, but it's not very interesting for the user. So step 9, the image of the dice are fixed 101 by 100 points, so only 3 dice images fit on the screen. Use the disable modifier with the add dice button to prevent people from having more than 3 dice. So same logic. When we reach a number of 3 dice, we disable the button. So you can have between 1 and 3 dice, but no less and no more. And now the UI is much safer and less bug prone, which is quite nice. Next section, adapt the interface for more dice. We're going to use flexible width and height to allow the dice image to dynamically resize based on the number of dice on the screen. So it's very interesting because it's a more advanced UI use case. So we're going to increase the dice limit to 5 and tap add dice until there are 5 dice. So we increase the limit to 5. By the way, in a real app here, you wouldn't have just these numbers written here, which is what's called magic numbers, but rather you would create a constant that would be, for instance, called maximum number of dice and minimum number of dice. This way you give meaning to these numbers. Otherwise, it's what's called a magic number. And you're saying, FYI, SF Symbols has a dice and a dice fill symbol. Oh, that's nice. Let's have a look. So if it's like fill, so it's not like that. Oh no, there is something else also. So it should be something. So let me see. You can do like dice like that. Oh, like that. And okay, so it could be used, for instance, if you had several tabs in your app, you could use it as the icon for the tabs. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool to know. Thanks for mentioning it. Okay, let me go back to the tutorial. So they say an hashtag view always gives its subviews their requested size, even if it needs to extend beyond the bounds of the screen. Very important to keep that in mind. The parent view offers like the parent view informs the child view of the available space, but if the child view wants more than this, it can still draw outside of the parent. And so they say that you need to pin the content view preview, then switch to dice view. Okay, so what we do is that we pin the content view preview, and then we switch back to dice view. This way we can still see the content view while we are updating the dice view. Okay, how do we update it? They say use a flexible frame to allow the dice images to shrink and tap add dice until there are 5 dice again. So instead of frame width and height, we use max width and max height. I think we used it with infinity last time. This time we're giving actual values, so we're just renaming width to max width and height to max height. And it means that it will try to take as much as this width and this height, but if there is less available, it will take less. You can also give min width and min height in order to give a minimum size. We'll see if we use this or not. And they say, try to add more. You can see that now they all fit. They just don't preserve their aspect ratio because here, since there isn't enough space to fit enough squares, they start, I mean, it's not that, it's more like they don't have enough space to fit 100 of width, but they do have enough space to fix 100 of height. So the width gets compressed, but not the height, hence the lack of the square aspect ratio. Maybe we try and fix this. That's what they say. Now that the dice images have flexible width and heights, the hashtag can shrink them to fit on the screen. But when there are 4 or 5 dice, they are stretched vertically because there's nothing above or below the hashtag to limit its height. To prevent this, set the aspect ratio of the dice image to 1 and tap add dice until there are again 5 dice. So indeed, you are indeed giving the correct solution. So using resizable, which is already the case. And we can use scale to fit, which is a shortcut for what we're about to do right now. So they say, to provide an aspect ratio of 1, so square, and content mode fit. So it says that we will try to fit the view in the available space on the opposite of fill, where fill is going to try to take as much space as possible, and it doesn't solve our problem. What do they say? They say that a one or square aspect ratio has equal width and height. So when you divide the width by the height, you get 1. That's the definition of a square. The fit content mode means that if the image doesn't have the same aspect ratio as the available space, it will shrink to the smaller axis and leave empty space on the other. Here, since the image is already square, it's not the case, but if we had an image either in landscape or portrait aspect ratio, we would have seen a difference. And indeed, as you were saying, Yash, instead of doing aspect ratio content mode fit, you can just do scaled to fit, which does the exact same thing. It's just it's a shortcut. One thing that's important is that I think that if you put it in an other order, okay, no, it's still okay. This one is still correct, but yeah, don't put it before the resizable, because resizable can only be applied on an image, and when you call this modifier, you've lost the information that it's an image and not just any kind of view. So once again, the order does matter, and they put it after the frame, so I will put it at the same place. Okay, so you can see that using flexible width actually in SwiftUI is quite simple. You just use the frame modifier with max width, max height, and if needed, min width and min height. This is easier than in UIKit, where you would have needed to put probably like a stack view and then play on the compression resistance and content hugging priorities, and it's quite confusing, to be honest. Even after years of doing iOS, I still get confused by it. So that's one of the things, to be honest, that I really like about SwiftUI. These nice modifiers that make quite advanced UI use cases very simple to implement. Because it's advanced, but it's also very common. And arguably, you could say that a criterion to judge how good a framework is whether it makes common use cases easy to implement. Next section is using images in button labels. So we're going to customize the add and remove dice buttons to display images instead of text. So in content view, add another argument to the add dice button to add an image. So we can pass a system image if we want. So we'll do it for the add dice button here. So like that. And we can see that we've added indeed an icon on the left of the text. And they say the view a button displays is called its label. In many cases, you'll use a combination of images and text for button labels. For this button, an image is enough to tell people what it does, but a button should always have a text label, visible or not, so that it's available for people who rely on features like VoiceOver. So what the feature that reads the content of the screen, the accessibility feature. So we're going to hide the button text using the label styled modifier, and this time use icon only. You can notice that we pass it on the H tag and not on the button, and they say even though the modifier affects both buttons, the remove dice button still has a text label because it has no icon to display. And how is it possible that we apply the modifier on the H tag and it still has an effect on the buttons? It's because the data is passed to the child views using something called the environment. I won't cover it into details, but you have it covered in details in my SwiftUI videos. You're saying, can min sizes be a priority? So absolute minimum size physically, proportion of the parent view size. Yes, you can do it. So if you want to use a proportion of the parent view size, you will want to use a geometry reader, which allows you to get the size of the parent, and then you could take the width of the parent and then divide it equally, for instance. So you could do it like that. I mean, if you want to divide equally, that's what we already did. It's useful if you want to divide unequally. Maybe give 20% to the first view, 10% to the second, and the rest to the other, for instance. And absolute minimum size physically, yes, absolute minimum size physically. So you have the min height and min width arguments, actually. So like here you see you have like, you have the min width argument along with max width and min height along with max height. So this is indeed absolutely doable. Both would be doable. So first one with min width and min height, second one with a geometry reader. Okay, so we have the icon for the second button. And then what else do we have? So increase the button size using a title font. Once again, we apply it on the H tag so that it gets distributed conceptually to both the child views of the H tag. So we can see the button is now bigger. See a good remark. Jetpack Compose does this really well with modifier weight, where you can make a view take up a proportion of the view. Oh, that's nice. Indeed, it's smart to be able to have this very declarative approach. I'm sure that you can probably like re-implement it in SwiftUI. Maybe some people did in open source. Sorry about that. Sorry for your eardrums if you were listening with headsets. But thanks for mentioning it, because I haven't really tried Jetpack Compose. So thanks for mentioning it. And indeed, like, it seems like a smart API to be able to give weight, and then the relative difference between the weights gives the result. And yeah, you can also like maybe multiple spacers, even though that's a good question. Like if you put two spacers, like if you put like two spacers on the left and one spacer on the right, does it take more space on the left than it does on the right? To be honest, I'm not sure how it works. I'm not sure if because since like spacers should represent infinity, like, you know, like infinity plus infinity is still infinity. So I'm curious to see whether spacers can implement this notion of weight or not. That's a very, very good question. I will try to test it afterwards. You know what? I will put a screenshot. I'm screenshotting your comment, because if it does, it will make a great topic for a video in the future. So I will try it. Okay. And then, as you can imagine, we use an image for the other button. So this time minus circle fill. And we have our plus and minus buttons that look a bit more like what we would expect to see. And what's nice is that since they move a bit, their movement is also animated, and it's because since the height of the H tag changes, then the position of the button also changes by way of consequence. All right, section 7, improve your app design. So we're going to style the buttons and dice and give our app a background color. So they say, add a background color set named app background. So we've done it last time, so I won't cover into details. And they say, choose your color set names carefully. I would even say choose all of your identifiers names carefully. Some names, like background and blue, conflict with existing system-defined color. Oh, that makes sense. Okay, so create a background color, and we're going to call it, to give it these values. So let's do it. So I go into the asset catalog here. So we create a new color set. I'm gonna call it background color like that. It's gonna be a single value for both light mode and dark mode. And I need to give it its value. So they put it in a display p3, which is a different color space. I won't go into detail of what the color space is, but basically it's the amount of colors that can be represented by the screen. And so the wider the color space, the more colors you can display. Like now the analogy might not speak to people who are younger, but back in the 90s and early 2000s, when there was a lot of like improvement, you could see that you had computers that could display first like tens of thousands of colors, and it was like a marketing argument. Then it was like millions of colors, and it used to be like one of the marketing arguments that you would have. That's how they marketed computers to you back then. Just like saying like, you know, like 100 songs in your pockets for Xcode is the same thing. I'm going to move the window so you can see what I'm typing, and so the values are 0.208. So 0.208. I need to put a comma because my computer is using the French local. So comma 478. So comma 478 like that. I don't think I've ever used monochrome console monitors to be honest. I started like with like Windows 95, so we already had like things that kind of resembled a modern UI, except that it was like the screens were super small and they were killing your eye. But that's all we had back then, so it was still kind of nice. Okay, so that's the core that we have, and as Yash is saying, we're going to see that Xcode is going to automatically generate a code identifier for this color name, which is pretty cool. So let me move the window back to full width, and let's go back to the code. And so we are going to use it around here. So yes, we set a background, so on the VStack of the content view. And okay, they have called it app background. So you know what? I'm going to do the same than they do this way. There is less chance of making a mistake for people who are following the tutorial. And so here, background will be app background like that. And so this is an identifier generated based on the name of the color right here. And it's a new feature of Xcode 15. Before that, you had to either pass in the name of the color as a string, which is not type safe. It's not checked by the compiler that the color does exist. And you had to use third-party tools from the community, which were great to do this. But now Xcode does it out of the box, and it's a pretty cool new feature. So then they say, use the tint modifier on the VStack to apply a global white tint to the app, because contrast is a good thing for a beautiful UI. So like that. That seems better. We can see it doesn't apply to everything. Interesting. Maybe they explain why. The tint modifier only affects views that rely on the accent color, typically controls such as buttons and toggles. Views use tint in different ways. For example, notice that the roll button gained a subtle white background. Oh yes, indeed. The background changed a bit. And so they say, change the color of the text view to white using foreground style. So we do this on here, the dice roller title like that. So now it's in white. And to make the background expand to fill the screen, use a frame, pass infinity for the max width and max height parameters, so that the frame will expand in both directions as far as it can go. So we are saying that this view here, this VStack, so what's in blue, should take all of the space available, and we do it like we saw last time by passing a frame, by calling the frame modifier with a max width of infinity and a max height of infinity. And it covers all of the space available, including space outside of the safe area, so including space like around the dynamic island and around the app switcher at the bottom. And yeah, why did they change it to foreground style and deprecate foreground color? I guess foreground style is maybe a bit more generic because it takes a style, and so a color is a style, but a shape apparently is also a shape style. So I think it makes it more generic. That must be the reason. But at the cost that foreground color was a bit more explicit. But they made that change fairly recently, because at the beginning it was just like foreground color and the background color, and life was simpler back then. So step 6, classic dice are solid white with black pips. To make the dice face solid, open the dice view fill and use the fill variant of the dice symbol name. So we're going to add a fill at the end, so here. So we add after the number of pips fill, so now they are filled. Okay. And now set the foreground color of the dice to white. Notice that this changes the dice to white but leaves the pips transparent. So we are playing on transparency in order to have the pips be the background color that way. Well, that's quite nice. That's quite nice. I think maybe now some symbols, at least in SF symbols, have different layers, and so you can color the symbols in different ways. So maybe it's also possible to for this one to cover the border and the pips in different ways. Actually, I'm not sure, but if you want to try it, you can definitely try it. And you're saying Jetpack Compact composes way of the infinite frame is just modifier fill max size, fill max width, and fill max height are also alternatives. Yeah, it makes sense, and it kind of makes sense because Android, their previous systems which use like XML to declare the view, what you would do is that when you declare the view for its width and height, you would say either wrap content or match parent. So I think they probably wanted to have something that had the same level of expressivity and simplicity. So that's why I guess they did the fill max size. But in a way, if you wanted, you could create your fill max size and under the hood call frame max width infinity, for instance. So you could always build it for yourself if you wanted. To be honest, I would still recommend to keep with the basic modifiers because it's much more easier for someone else to understand your code. But in a way, I think you can. I think here it's more a question of like naming and encapsulating, but I don't think there is a question of like one allows you to express more things than the other. But I might be wrong on that one. Okay. And now we're going to make the pips black. So actually, we do the thing where we pass in several colors. Great. So it's possible. I was right. So to make the pips black, use two foreground colors, one primary and one secondary. Use the foreground style modifier to set the primary color to black and the secondary color to white. And it probably also answers your question, Yash, of why they did foreground style instead of foreground color, because you have the flexibility apparently of passing more than one argument. And maybe this flexibility would have been harder to get with foreground color, because then you would have to call it like foreground color and foreground colors. But then if either you have two of them or you have just one but foreground colors, and most of the time people will only pass one color, so it feels a bit weird. So that might be the reason why they chose this name of style, which is a bit more generic. But yeah, same, like I never knew that you could do it, or maybe I saw it in a WWDC video like 1 or 2 years ago when they added the feature, and then I forgot about it, as it's always the case of like most of what you see during WWDC week, because so much content, but then the hard part is remembering it for the long run. So let's make actually this change. So let's go back to Xcode, and then I will read the longer explanation. But now we have the result. Wow, it's nice. It's nice. And you're saying, yeah, you would expect a foreground to only have one color, so two colors, a bit difficult to visualize. Yeah, it's like foreground style, and then you're passing an array of colors with the primary color and the secondary color. And then I guess the idea is that it's up to the view to interpret this as it makes sense for it. So an SF symbol in an image interprets it in a way, but maybe your own views could interpret it in a very different ways. And so what we're seeing is the effect of SF symbol palette rendering mode. So it's the official name of this like layered coloring that I was mentioning. For the field dice symbols, the pip assumes the primary color, while the rest takes on the secondary color. Note, some SF symbols are composed in a hierarchy with different elements that can take on primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. There are 4 symbol rendering modes, which you can set manually using the symbol rendering mode modifier. You can read more about rendering modes and much more about SF symbols in the human interface guidelines. Remember, you can access them in Xcode by doing Command, Shift, and H. quite a fun shortcut that actually like opens Safari out of nowhere to the human interface guidelines, which I recommend that you explore because it's a great resource as an iOS developer. Okay, actually, end of the chapter. So let's check our understanding. Then we will have the recap, and I will stop here for today, and I will do the final chapter in the next video. So the quiz. This time there are 4 possible answers instead of 3. So select all true statements about view state. First one, SwiftUI automatically updates a view when the value of any of its addState property changes. This one is tricky. This one is tricky because up until iOS 16, it was the case. When a property that was addState would change, the body would be computed again. However, in iOS 17, when you use the observability that iOS 17 introduced, there is a change, subtle but important, is that SwiftUI will only recompute the body if the add state property was actually used inside the body. So it no longer recomputes the body when the property add state was not used. But here, I guess, because they haven't gone into this level of detail here, it's supposed to be true. But if you use an app in iOS 17 with iOS 17 observability, then it's not always true. However, for you, it shouldn't make any real difference. It's more of a performance question than a conceptual question of how your view behaves. So this one should be true. You mark add state properties with the public keyword. No, it's the inverse. They should be. How do I select more than one? Like, how do I select more than one actually? I don't know how I should select more than one. With Shift, it doesn't work. With Command, it doesn't work. I have no idea how I'm supposed to select. Or maybe all of the other ones are false. If that's the case and all of the other ones are false, it's kind of a very funny way to phrase the question. But you mark add state properties with the public keyword is not true, so it's false. Use modify to change the value of a state property. No, you just assign a new value, so it's false. And you can change the value of a view's add state property from outside the view, so it's false also. So only this one is true, and okay, that's why you cannot select multiple ones. But yeah, okay, funny way to phrase the question. So I was correct. That's the only true statement. A add state property connects your view to the SwiftUI state management system. I see a few comments. So pronunciation tip, hierarchy is clear said, starting with a hard H for high, so as in high. So hierarchy. Okay, so hierarchy. All right. Is it like a thing where like British and American have a different way of saying? But okay, hierarchy. It kind of makes sense. It's true that hierarchy, it feels really like the way we say it in French, but hierarchy might be okay. That's a good one because I didn't thought of it at all. So thank you for this one. Hierarchy, yes, makes sense. And I think state has always been property based. It was just add state object that did object level change tracking. So yes, add state has always been property based indeed, but they've unified this even more in iOS 17. There are less different ways to annotate state. And you're saying the last one can be true, but hopefully you never find yourself in that situation. Yeah, indeed. And also, I mean, since like views are structs, to do it would be like very convoluted in a way, and would also like kind of like defy the purpose of how you are supposed to write SwiftUI code. So yes, it's more like you're not supposed to do it, rather than it's technically infeasible to do it. And yeah, maybe it's more British. Maybe actually it's more British. Yeah, that might be the case. Okay, what's the correct button code? So this one, oh no, this one has a parenthesis here, so it doesn't seem correct. This one seems similar to what we use. We pass in a string for the title of the button and then a closure after. This one feels very like Python-like, but it's not Python. And this one feels, this one is interesting because this one gives the idea that you could add the closure afterwards using a modifier. And this is not the correct way to do it, but it kind of allows me to answer a question you might have, which is, why are some arguments passed through the initializer and some others passed through a modifier? So just to make sure that I said it correctly, why are some arguments passed through the initializer and some other passed through a modifier? The reason is that when you give arguments to initializer, you are guaranteed that all arguments will be given a value, either a default value that you provided or a value provided by the caller. On the other hand, you can never guarantee that a modifier will be called. So here you could say, for a button, having an action that can be triggered when the button is tapped, it's really part of what the button does. A button that doesn't trigger any action has no sense, has no meaning, has no reason to exist. That's why it makes sense to pass the closure action as part of the initializer of the button, because a button without said closure has no reason to exist. On the other hand, something like changing the button style makes sense to do it through a modifier because some buttons you might want to change their styles, some other you might want not to do it, but a button with no change in the style still has a good reason to exist. So that's the reason why there are these two design patterns in how in which place in which place is the best to declare an argument, if it's mandatory, or rather if it doesn't make sense for the component to exist without it, then it should be done through the init, otherwise through a modifier. And so this is the correct one. A closure contains code in braces. Okay, how do you disable a button? So interestingly, so it's disabled disabled true is correct, but there might be a shorter version where you can just say disabled without passing true with a default value for the argument. So actually, let's just have a look here in the content view. If we look, so actually, no, it doesn't seem that you can just do disabled. It seems that you always need to pass in an expression. Yes, so you always need to pass in an expression. It makes sense that there is no shortcut, because having a button that is always disabled doesn't really make sense. The only reason to do it is kind of like a scaffolding, like you haven't finished building your app and so it's always disabled. But in production, a button that can never be enabled should never be there, because it means the closure can never be called. So maybe make it a text in that case, but don't make it a button. So it makes sense that there is no shortcut where you have a default value of true by default. And so it's a good question that they ask, because it shows this subtlety, and you need to pass true because you need to explicitly mention that the button will always be disabled, and this should highlight the fact that that's not really something that should happen. There should always be a reason for the button to be enabled, but you can still express this by explicitly passing the value true. Okay, so as always, there is a quick, it can be a bit long, but there is a wrap up and a recap after the chapter, so let's cover it. So this chapter covered buttons and state. So button, state, and closures are key components of SwiftUI, and closures are even key components of Swift. They enable your app to respond to user actions, which lets you create powerful and expressive interfaces. So which concept have we learned? Before this tutorial, you wrote exclusively declarative SwiftUI code that describes how an app looks and functions. For Dice Roller, you needed to interact with your app by tapping a button. A button uses imperative code inside its action closure, which SwiftUI runs when someone taps it. So the difference between declarative and imperative, I'm going to sum it quickly, even though it's a topic that you can really explore at length, but declarative code says what should be built, but don't say how it should be built. So when you say I want a text with this font, you're not saying which object should be created, how the character should be displayed on the screen. You're just saying I want a text that displays this with this font, and then it's SwiftUI jobs to actually do the imperative part. And for a button, you need to have an imperative part, which you do for a closure, and the imperative part is code that says step by step what's happening. So take this value, increase it by 1, decrease it by 1, set a random value to it, etc., etc. Was there any reason why toggles weren't used for today's button at all? You mean toggles? What do they look like, toggles in SwiftUI? I'm not, I'm not sure. I have I see the ID, but a toggle is when you want to switch from one state to another. So we have a toggle. What does it look like? Okay, what could be its style? You can give it a label. I don't know if I say like hello, for instance. No. How do you create a toggle? I'm not sure how you create one. Maybe I can see it. Okay. Oh, okay. So yeah, so the toggle, okay, it's the on-off. Okay. So it's the on-off. Okay, it's the thing to say whether it's on or off. Yes. So two things. Yes, toggle use binding, which is a way to pass state to a child view in a way that the child view can mutate it. So it's a bit more advanced. So okay, your question was more why didn't we use a toggle rather than why didn't we use a toggle to implement the UI? Because I was like, where would you use a toggle in this UI? Okay, so I understand your question now, and yeah, to understand toggle, you have to understand binding. So maybe they will mention it in the next chapter. Otherwise, I've covered bindings in my more like advanced tutorial on SwiftUI. So learning SwiftUI when you already know UIKit. So you can check this out after, and you will see how it's covered. And yeah, indeed, Wi-Fi on and off, plane mode on and off. So it's a toggle. Indeed. All right. Yeah, and I was thinking also like toggles. I'm always confused because toggle wasn't called toggle in UIKit. I think it was called the UI switch. That might be the reason why the name toggle always like I have a hard time like thinking what it is, because for a very long time it had a different name. Let me just see, like is it like UI? Yeah, UI switch indeed. But toggle is a more correct name in a sense. And yeah, so radio button is different. Radio button, it's a set of buttons, and only one of them can be enabled at the same time. So like when you push one button, it pops the other one that was already enabled. So it's still a different beast. I think you can enable radio buttons in SwiftUI. It's by using something that's called a segmented control, if I remember it correctly. Let's get back to this. So we were here. So take a look at the declaration of a button initializer. The part here, so parentheses arrow void, after the action parameter is a closure type. The empty parentheses and the void following the arrow mean that this is the simplest form of closure, one that takes no argument and returns nothing. It just implements side effects. You can create one with a pair of curly braces containing the code you want to run, for instance, like this. The example above demonstrates trailing closure syntax, which you can use when the final parameter of an initializer is a closure. And actually, not just an initializer, any kind of function. It works with any kind of function. We saw it when we called the with animation function, for instance. If you prefer, you can include the action argument label. Here's how you'd initialize a button of this type without calling a closure. So this code here is the same as this code right here, except that here you've written everything, but you have this shorter syntax that's available in Swift. I see a suggestion about one of the... Yes, I'm making a screenshot of the suggestion about how to implement the init with NSCoder. Yes, that's a good idea. That's a great idea. So I'm making a screenshot of it. So which topic and skills have we covered? Creating and customizing buttons, customizing them either through the action that they run or through the button style, which is a way to style the button, executing code with closures, the trailing closure syntax, updating a view with add state properties, and creating a dynamic number of views with for each. If you want to continue practicing, so to go further, you can extend the app we've written by changing the button border shape of the roll button to a capsule. So rather than a rounded rectangle, rather a capsule, which is a slightly different shape. You can customize the remove dice and add dice buttons using the symbol rendering mode, maybe to put a different color on the plus and minus, for instance. Maybe have the plus be green, the minus be red. Why not? 3, instead of having an image of a dice and the roll button benefits, modify dice view so people can tap on the dice itself to randomize it. So to make the dice the button itself. And actually, this is easier to do than what you would imagine, because the tricky part here is to understand that a button here, we've given it just a string, but there is another initializer where you can give it what's called a label, and the label can be any kind of view. So you can move the whole dice view inside a button, and it will work perfectly. And you're saying bordered prominent makes it like a capsule shape. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm never sure what the button style look like. So let's actually try it. You know what? Where was the button style used? Was it? No, it was in the dice view. So let's try to do bordered prominence. So it seems it did something different, but we don't have a capsule shape. A capsule shape here, you would have like half circles on the left and on the right. So that's what a capsule shape would be like. So apparently, prominent border does something else. Yeah, tapping on a dice. I guess it feels very weird when you are an English native speaker. And if you want to challenge yourself, so here often it's a way to go further, but which is more complex, or rather that requires more autonomy on your part. So they say create a simple button app. So start a new Xcode project and create a 1 or 2 button app of your choice. You can use the design a simple app project to help you come up with an ID. So it's more like think about something that can be done with 1 or 2 buttons and implement it. So typical example would be generating random numbers, but it's arguably what we've done already. It could be also, I know it's what we in the Swift data part, which comes later, but which we've already covered in previous videos. There is something like that where you generate, I think, random facts about numbers. There is something like that. Or it could be just like displaying also like random colors, stuff like that. Or it could be like, I was about to say like guessing a number, but it requires a text field. So we'll see that just after. So actually, yeah, try to find your ID. Try to find your own ID and try to see if you can implement it. That's the best. And here there is 2 things to learn more. So reading about buttons in the Human Interface Guidelines and watching the Demystify SwiftUI WWDC sessions from, I think it was from 2021, if I'm correct, because I remember watching it in my old apartment. And I really recommend watching this one because it goes into a lot of details of like how SwiftUI works under the hood, and the minutes you will spend watching this will be very, very, very well spent. I see a question. Will the editor take me to a new view if tapping a button invokes that view, or must I also switch to that in preview? So if you navigate to a new view, it will work in the preview as long as your view is also embedded in a navigation stack inside the preview. So it's just a question of whether your view is inside a navigation stack. It's not linked to the preview itself. It's just like, is it in navigation stack? And if not, then in the preview, you will need to add it in the preview if it's not in it by itself. But otherwise, it should absolutely work. And what will be next? So for the next video, for the final chapter, so dynamic behavior often extends beyond managing 1 or 2 pieces of data. Many apps manage a collection of things like contacts that might change in quantity. In the next tutorial, you'll use an array to store a variable list of data and a for each view to create subviews corresponding to each item on the array. And you'll learn how to add items to the array using another iOS essential feature, the on-screen keyboard. So next time it will be about creating dynamic content. So we'll do it live. We'll do it live not next week, because next week I should be in the US if all goes according to plan. So we will probably do it in 2 weeks, unless I'm sick when I get back from the US. So then it will be in 3 weeks. But normally the final chapter should be in 2 weeks. Yeah, I just have to say, so as always, a big thank you to people who watched live and who asked great questions and made great remarks. Always make it super enjoyable for me, and it really like elevates the quality of the replay for people who are watching the replay. So thank you. And am I going to Dub? Yes, I am going to Dub. I got the invite last week, and I still need to book the flights and hotel. I need to do it tomorrow because the prices are rising. But yes, I will be going to Dub. So I'm going to the US not next week, like in 2 days. And then I'm going back in June again. So very fortunate on this front. So if you see less live streams on the Mondays, that will also explain why. But yeah, it's gonna be exciting, and I will try to create a bit of content while I'm there. So if you have any ideas for content that I could create while I'm there, let me know in the comments on Twitter, on LinkedIn, wherever. I'm all ears. I'm not saying that I will be able to do everything, but the more ideas I have, the better I will be able to do stuff. and of course looking forward to meeting anyone else that will be also going there. Yeah, a vlog would be nice. The thing with a vlog is that a vlog is always surprisingly harder to do usually, but more like smaller content on social media. I have the Ray-Ban Meta glasses with the camera, so that will be pretty cool. So I will try to. Oh yes, and showing the snacks. Yes, yeah. I remember the snacks were really nice, good quality, and like there were so many like Haribo candies available for free. It's like I mean, it's not good for your health, but having that like you can grab it or grab a Starbucks coffee for free. It was amazing. I mean, I still remember I went in 2019. I still remember that 5 years later. So it shows that it was quite memorable. All right. And for today, it's time for me to go to sleep. I need to catch on and get some rest before I go to the US. So yeah, just have to say like thank you for watching, and see you in 2 or 3 weeks for the final part of the tutorial on how to get started with iOS with Swift, Xcode, and SwiftUI. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.